everybody. Thank you for joining the sixth and final session in our dialogue series on exploring East Africa's wildlife economy. My name is Frank Voorhees, and I run the African Wildlife Economy Institute at Stellenbosch University. We've done this series in partnership with Share Screen Africa, who are our logistical partners who are able to get these out on the web and so on. So after this is over, you'll be able to share it as well with colleagues through the internet, the recording, and also with the with the African Leadership University School of Wildlife Conservation, who helped us put the series together, and Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation. So thanks again for joining the session. I'm going to step out now, bring Reinhard on to facilitate the session. We have three fascinating speakers. And like you, I'm really looking forward to hearing the discussion that's coming. So Reinhard, can I turn it over to you to take us through the hour? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank, for the great introduction. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for this interesting and the ultimate session of this series that we hope will lead into major transformations in the region. So I'd welcome you to this session. We'll make it as conversational as possible. And the panelists, we have Mr. Ali Kaka from an IUCN Council member for Africa. We have Mr. Frederick Kwame, Vice President, Global Leadership, African Wildlife Foundation. And we have Ms. Lucy Waruingi, Executive Director for the African Conservation Center. And without further ado, and without taking much time, because we have the gist of the conversation at the tail end of the second half of this conversation. So I'll start by handing over the floor to Ali to have a chat with us. Welcome, Ali.
Thank you, Reinhard. And it's good to see so many old friends back again. Some of them are not showing their faces, but I'm sure they have good reasons. And I just want to, first of all, congratulate the African Wildlife Economy Institute for the series that have been taking place on the subject of wildlife economy. This is a great initiative and really much needed. And I only wish that, there were more people participating in these discussions, and then also would like to see this carried forward, I think, to the next steps, which would be great, because we're good at talking, but then we just leave it to ourselves. Yet we know very well that the decisions and implementation is really not going to be up to us entirely. And so there's a missing link there. And I really hope that we can at some point look into that, because that is a major weakness as far as I'm concerned. At least in my country, Kenya, that is a huge missing link. And my colleague, Lucy, will also attest to that. Now, jumping straight into what this topic is about, that's the policy framework or the policy dispensation. For Kenya in particular, and I'll restrict myself, of course, to the country I'm most familiar with. We, in 2020, and after many, many years, we finally had a revised wildlife policy. Now, this policy, and I'm not saying it only because I was involved in drafting it, actually made some amazing leaps and bounds in as far as wildlife conservation is concerned in the country. And I would invite you all to take a look at the policy. I'm sure it's on the website of the Ministry of Tourism and Wildlife. But if you have difficulties, Lucy and I would be happy to help you get a copy. This policy was passed by Parliament, and so it is a legal instrument. in as far as I'm concerned. And it was the very first policy for the new government to pass. So it was a great achievement at that time. Since then, our roadmap was to then go ahead and revise the parent legislation, the Wildlife Act of Kenya, and that is the normal process for any country. You develop your policy, which then allows you to revise your the main legislation based on the policy, which is what was done. And again, I was involved in the take of it all. And we did our best to make sure that the new wildlife legislation for Kenya mirrored the new wildlife policy that had been drafted. And we finalized that just before the end of the last government and the end of the term of the ministry at that time where I was sitting. So we left the draft for the new team coming in to implement. Unfortunately, that hasn't quite happened. I will not go political on that, so we'll just leave it at that. I hear several things that there is going to be another draft of the Wildlife Act, and I'm really looking forward to have seen some drafts, but nothing really has been implemented in terms of enacting the new Wildlife Conservation and Management Act for Kenya. So there is a missing portion in the implementation process. Now, the new policy spoke of a number of new things that need to be done to enhance the wildlife economy sector and to provide more incentives for landowners in particular to benefit from the wildlife that they are hosting on their land. And as I said, it was quite a leap into a new arena, a new era for wildlife conservation. So there were new things that had not been done previously. There were some things that have been done previously, had been stopped, and now we were recommending that this be examined now in detail for implementation. As you may know, Kenya has, use of natural resources in several sectors. The forestry, for example, there's a whole array of use allowed, permitted legally on forestry products. It's there, including medicinal plants and plants that are used for cosmetic purposes. So this is all in practice now and has been for many, many years. I would also throw in fisheries. And as you know, fisheries has been a backbone of natural use for many, many years and has benefited Kenyans across the coastline, as well as the freshwaters. So there are, and there are many others, so there are examples of other uses, and this was again examined closely by a study done by this School of Wildlife Studies, and they came up with a report. Again, this is a very valuable report as a reference document for those who haven't read it. And they did one for Kenya and many other countries as well. And they highlighted what other uses there are potentially available for Kenya to examine. Wildlife has remained a very restricted sector in the country, fortunately. And there's so much potential in that sector. For now, all we see is tourism, which is the main real use, you could say, of wildlife in the country. They are using the old legislation other species that are allowed, some species that are allowed for use in terms of trade, in terms of meat products, but there's so few, and you could count them on one hand. Yet there is potential as well of use of other, and I'm not talking about endangered species here, or even hunting, which is a big H word in the country. So let's park that. I don't want to get into that. I would love to, but let's not. In the new act that we drafted earlier, and it's reflected in the policy, we also encourage trade in live wildlife, domestically for that matter, but also externally if necessary. And this was, when we were talking to the stakeholders, this was had quite positive reactions that, yes, live trade is harmless. Why not do it? And it could be an economic basis for our conservation workers, landowners as well. So I'm trying to be brief here, but a lot of this is available. It's there for people to reflect on. I just want to underline that there is potential. There is great potential if done properly and correctly. And that's now where we need to go from here, should the final wildlife legislation have these opportunities available legally. There is, I think, a desperate need, I believe, for the wildlife economy to address continentally. The African Union can play a much stronger role, I believe, in having the wildlife economy a principal objective to make sure countries across the continent do recognize the potential of the wildlife economy and do it more aggressively and with more interest. And I think that would be an added advantage rather than leaving it for nations alone to temper and try and do what they think is best. So there is a gap there. I know there's some programs on the African Union, but let's see some more active, and more aggressive push from that side. In terms of institutions, also that again I recognize as a weakness, even in Kenya. Well, let me just say, particularly in Kenya, we have great institutions in Kenya Wildlife Service and others, but this sector of wildlife use for the economy, or wildlife economy in particular, I don't think there is an institutional capacity as well as a setup within the institution that are responsible for wildlife that would focus on wildlife economy. It is just one of the activities that is being looked at, but there isn't a formation within these institutions, including the Wildlife Research Institute and the Kenya Wildlife Service and even the ministry. And I think that, again, is a weakness that needs to be addressed. If there's going to be proper, appropriate, and serious implementation on the wildlife economy, or to broaden the economy relating specifically for wild animals, there has to be that institutional setup and capacity. So I don't know, Reynard, if you want me to go on, or is my time up? I'm not sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think you raised a very, very valid point, which maybe we'll expand more on later. For now, I'd hand over the floor to Fred to give us his highlights, then we get to the beef part.
Thank you very much, Reinhard. And again, I would like to thank, like my colleague Ali Kak, I would like to thank the Africa Wildlife Institute, Wildlife Economic Institute in Stellenbosch, led by Frank, for the wonderful and stellar job you've done in bringing this subject matter to the fore. I believe that the issue of the Africa wildlife as an asset is primary to addressing biodiversity loss and climate change. Before I go further, let me just introduce myself briefly. So I am Fred Kwame Kuma. I work for the Africa Wildlife Foundation. I lead the work here with respect to policy and partnerships with institutions across the continent and beyond. One of the key things, and the reason I'm introduced to myself as such, is that one of the key things that the Africa Wildlife Foundation really prides itself for is a focus on Africa and the need for conservation to be coupled with development. And that's for me and for the Africa Wildlife Foundation is the crust of the opportunity that we have with wildlife economy. If you may, wildlife economy presents us as a continent with an opportunity to develop our economies differently than other continents and northern or western countries have done. Currently, the total value of what this presents to us is not being actually met at all. Currently, just from a tourism perspective, Africa makes close to $13 billion from ecotourism, which in my mind should be more significant than that, but nonetheless, it's what we are currently making. In terms of wildlife ranching, we are talking of over 50 to 60 million dollars annually. In terms of subsistence fishing, we are talking of close to 24 billion, and that's only 25% of the current potential that we could have in that respect. In a nutshell, a lot is happening in terms of the wildlife economy, but it isn't as structured. We believe strongly that if this economy can be structured, there will be some significant gains to the continent. I'll give you an example. Ghana, the country that I represent, back in the 60s, decided to focus on cocoa production for developing an income for through exports for the nation. Currently, Ghana makes close to $300 million from it, and most farmers, smallholder farmers, are connected to the cocoa industry. I personally was raised through the income drive from cocoa farming that my parents had. And I know the power of cocoa. And the thing that cocoa actually does is that it integrates very well with nature. It's part of the forest cover, and it allows for us to maintain conservation and that as well make some income out of it. The other product in Ghana that is quite significant and growing is shea butter. The kernels value over $100 million annually for Ghana, and it's growing. The market for shea butter and cocoa continentally can be significant income streams for the continent. Africa is challenged in its development, and is also challenged from a conservation perspective to deliver conservation for people. Wildlife economy offers that opportunity for us to connect conservation with development in a concrete way. A few key things that I think we need to consider, and to some extent Ali raised it. The economy around wildlife is not structured as it could be. And for us to structure that, we need to begin at the policy level. In Kenya has done a great job in terms of providing a policy framework. I think all countries on the continent need to begin to think about that. And potentially, perhaps we need a continental framing policy for it. Most recently, the Africa Union adopted the Africa Biodiversity Strategic Plan as a framework for the Global Biodiversity Framework. I think that within that framework, we need to be looking at a framework that perhaps addresses wildlife economy. I'm not sure where it sits, but that framework, if it's developed, can provide continental guidance for countries to hinge onto. Once the policy framework is there, it allows for nation states to align their development sectors to it. And here, it's really critical because to develop a sector, a wildlife economy sector and value chain, it takes several sectors and actors. And so you need a system approach to it, and it takes a policy framework to align all the elements of that. You need finance to come into play to support actors in the value chain. You need producers to come into play to support the production of the assets. You need value chain processing alongside that asset base. And all of these things need to align for us to succeed. So the policy framework is really, really important. The other thing that my colleague Alikaka did mention was institutions, and institutions in terms of formal institutions, but also the sort of semi-formal institutions, right from the grassroots level. We need to organize our producers in cooperatives and in working communities that then can aggregate their production to scale. Because without scale, it's very difficult to bargain and get the right markets and price for the commodity. Back in the 60s, Ghana's really struggled to get the right price for cocoa until Ghana came together and brought actors together. Essentially in Ghana, cocoa is bought through a common system, and that allows for the nation to aggregate and then get the best price for it. And I think that needs to go for all other products as well. The other thing I think we need to look at more keenly is research around the potential of wildlife economy itself. There is so much potential out there, and we need to understand that potential. We need to look at diversification of the products. We are overly dependent on a few products. And I'll speak to Ghana. Ghana depends quite heavily on cocoa and shea butter as products, to some extent on other forest products, a lesser extent in tourism. But these sectors can be connected, actually. And we need to think through the potential for different sectors and then products, and then develop our value chains and allow these products and to thrive. The other key link that maybe one of my final comments would be around partnerships. Success really would depend on strategic partnerships. Partnerships across industry, partnerships across continents, partnerships across sectors. Because within these value chains, the actors require different things. And so bringing those actors together so that they are talking to each other and creating multi-stakeholder platforms that allows us to create an ecosystem around these value chains within the wildlife economy setup, I think is critical. Let me end by saying that wildlife economy is one of the most sustainable ways of driving an the economic growth of Africa, because it is potentially consistent with conservation and biodiversity. It's, if done well, will bring benefits down to communities, and in turn, communities will protect the biodiversity asset that contributes to their wildlife economies and practically to their livelihoods. So Africa's future really is in lifting up wildlife economy as a key sector to deliver to its sustainable development goals. These are my reflections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fred, for your very insightful presentation. I know I agree with both your sentiments and others, because right now we're talking about nature-based solutions, but right now it's moving from nature-based solutions to nature-based solutions for adaptation, which then brings into question the aspect of improving both people and biodiversity or ecosystem resilience. But I'll give the final chance to Lucy to share with us. Then we go to the conversation. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you. Thank you, Reinhard, and good morning, everyone. And thank you again, African Wildlife Economy Institute, Frank and your team for putting this series together. A very timely topic that people like Ali and myself started trying to dig into, I think about 1.5 years ago from a policy perspective. And I'll share, what I'll share is really, in one sense, reaffirming what both Ali Kaka and Fred have shared. I'll probably make emphasis on a few areas that we have tried to dig deeper to appreciate what it takes to catalyze movement towards this area. But I'd like to put one slide up, which has been a slide that has been very inspiring to me ever since the day I saw it. And I'm sure many of you have seen this slide, which is really talks about how do we bend the curve on biodiversity loss, and looking at the different scenarios of business as usual is going to keep us at a loss trajectory. Putting some increased conservation efforts may start to taper off and reduce the loss, but doesn't really help us regain what we had already lost. And transformative change would only come when we look beyond just increased conservation efforts, which are important, but also look at more sustainable production and more sustainable consumption. This graph for me just reminds us that we've got to think about doing business differently. And picking up from where Fred and Ali have spoken, I'd like to share some work we've started doing to reflect on what are the barriers that have limited countries to be able to both embed the wildlife economy in their own business models and policies, or to catalyze and scale up more growth. Let me say, when we started this discussion, we are doing a comparative study between South Africa and Kenya and looking at what their models are and what our models are, not from a point of cookie cutting, trying to replicate, but from a point of appreciating what's working where, under what conditions, and what opportunities do we have, and trying to find tools that can be used in any context and in any country. And we found that one of the things we are proposing is that this whole space needs to be broadened to look at both flora and fauna, which indeed is what it is. But sometimes when people hear wildlife economy, they assume it's only about the fauna and not the flora. But when we looked at the Africa Leadership University report, which I think Ali Kaka referenced, and we drilled down to the opportunities that we have, if we're looking at Kenya as a case study, we identified 7 models. And Fred gave the statistics of the potential for Africa. We then whittled down and looked at the potential for Kenya. And the models we looked around were, of course, tourism, which is still the mainstay today, but not diversified enough, and neither is it adequate. COVID was one example why you cannot have tourism as your only sort of pillar of focus. We looked at fisheries, we looked at non-timber forest products, we looked at bioprospecting, we looked at carbon markets, we looked at wildlife film and photography, and we looked at wildlife ranches as the 7 examples. And we tried to begin to understand what are the limiting factors that have kept us from maximizing the opportunities there. And I just want to focus on about 2 areas that have that grabbed us and have become, actually, let me say 3. One is the policy framework. And I think both Ali and Fred have mentioned that. That's got to be a policy framework that enables an expanded view of our natural capital asset, because this is what it is. It's an asset we have as a country. We may not be able to commodify it or want to commodify it in totality, but we can derive values from it that are tangible. So a policy framework that appreciates this value. But the key 2 other elements that emerged is that there isn't enough knowledge of the potential of these models that we can apply ourselves to. So even when we talked about tourism, whether international ecotourism or domestic, even when we talked about bioprospecting, even when we talked about viable wildlife ranching opportunities, we didn't have models that unpack what this looks like, so that the landowner, so that the business, private sector, so that the country government agencies would understand what is at stake and what is the opportunity. So one of the recommendations I'd like to put to this discussion is we do need to build knowledge products that create an understanding of the potential, because some of it is being applied, but at a very low scale. We can think about non-timber forest products. They're happening here and there, whether it's gum raisins or it's honey, but it's not at scale and it's not organized. Back to the point of how do you organize this so that it's creating tradable products that bring value at scale, but also the investment in ensuring that the landscapes that are supporting these investments are resilient is also not happening at scale. So you have pocket initiatives, I would want to call them pilot, which are probably working for a few singular farmers or a few small groups, but it's not been scaled up as an entity. We looked at livestock, for example. The potential for livestock is beyond meat. And in the semi-arid savannas, livestock ranching and wildlife ranching are really go hand in hand. And the same landscape produces great opportunities for both. But even where we have livestock ranching, we're not making best use of the leather, neither are we looking at other value-added products that we can apply ourselves to, be it in dried meat products, be it in using some of the horn. So there is a lot of lack of knowledge of the potential of this market. So this is one thing I'm hoping that even the Wildlife Institute in Stellenbosch, probably partnering with other research entities, could begin to ensure we have a good understanding of that. And then number two, the development of the value chain and bringing in the right business investors who can invest and bring producer groups, call them outgrowers, together so that you have a scalable investment, because most businesses are not going to invest significantly in projects that don't bring the value that can be scaled up. So how do we bring in business people? How do we unpack the entire value chain of each of these areas of potential, from production to how it's produced? I mean, it's sort of the growing of it, the production of it, and the packaging of it for market. And finally, my last comment is that what emerged for us in that workshop, which we held about 2 months ago, is that even where there is a framework that is legally acceptable by law, even before we expand the legal space, there seem to be many barriers because of the sectoral nature of how governments work. And some of these products, going from the landowner to the production stage to the marketing stage, you're dealing with different entities, either as government entities or licensing entities. And there are several barriers that are not restricted by law, but operationally are not working. So we had an example. For example, in our country, you can keep crocodiles and trade in the meat of crocodiles. But it's very difficult to get a license to trade in the skin of crocodiles. So it's almost illogical, because then you have a farmer who's growing crocodile, but where he can get a higher value of market, for example, from the skin, he cannot get the license. And it is not clear why he cannot get the license. So one of our third recommendations, which I'd like to present for discussion here, is where the barriers are more because of the siloed frameworks within government and within the business licensing entity, can there be an effort to have a body that looks at unlocking those? Because then we can unlock the potential for what's already in the legal framework, even as we choose to expand the framework beyond that. I'd like to pause on that and continue in discussions hereafter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So for the audience and the participants, you can ask your questions on the chat box. So picking up from your last conversation and the last point, and also friends, I think this question, I would channel it to all of you, and I'll put it in 2 fronts. Number one, as policymakers, especially now, I know Ali Kaka has worked a lot with the policymakers, and Fred as well. Have we done enough in terms of taking the power where it belongs? There's a huge balance or opportunities in changes in mindset, because we can develop the needed technology, but have we done enough to get the larger public to rally behind the aspirations of these policies that we've had? So that's my first question. And then the second question, the ALU report has been mentioned a lot. We had the Dasgupta review report that has been mentioned a lot, that circulated within the scientists, I would say, and academicians and researchers, and the converted conservationists. Have we done the same in translating the same, this particular report in an economically sensitive manner to the rightful policy makers in the region? So number one is that change in mindset with the larger public, not just conservationists, but the local communities and the larger peri-urban public, number one. And then number two, have we communicated or translated the same, this report that we have that speaks economically sense to the policymakers that are needed beyond just the conservation world? And if not, what do we need to do? I'll start with maybe Ali, then Lucy, then Fred.
No, give it to Fred now. I've been fast too long.
Okay, Fred.
So I think the two questions may be related, so I'll try and combine my response. So in my submission, I was talking about Ghana already, in a sense, leaning on wildlife economy way back in the 1960s. And one would argue that most of Africa's economy before the 60s was actually primarily linked to wildlife economies, though it wasn't structured as well. So from a perspective of wildlife economy, to a large extent, this is not new. And I think part of the challenge we have is that we are framing this as something new. And so people start thinking and wondering, what is this thing we are talking about? I mean, the largest income source for Ghana is cocoa. So it's all run by smallholders in a very sustainable way. Its wildlife economy has been there already. So why are we framing this as entirely new? Framing matters, and I think it's important. But when we frame it as new, then it's difficult for institutions to get their heads around it. And I think what ALU has done is really, really great. However, the approach to it is from a conservation perspective, which is great and is imperative that we all carry. But we need to turn it around from an economic perspective. So let's partner with the economic institutions on the continent. Let's partner with Africa Development Bank. Let's partner with UNICA. Let's partner with institutions of government that lead the economy to do this research. Then it becomes a bit easier. And I actually have to credit ALU for doing that in their the series of products that they've done, country products that they've done so far. And for almost all of them, there's been direct partnership with government. So that's really, really positive. But the focus of it needs to be mainstreamed so that it's not seen as outside the economy that you're bringing in. It's seen as mainstream to the economy. And I think when it becomes mainstream to the economy, then the buy-in becomes a bit easier. So more can be done. And certainly based upon what Lucy said, a lot more can be done in terms of creating the policy and legal framework to drive wildlife economy. Because at the moment, it's done in bits and pieces, and sectorially or product-wise, we choose and pick the ones that are in our immediate sphere of influence. So tourism, wildlife tourism, for instance, is a big one. But there are many others that I think can be even more powerful than wildlife tourism that we are not developing. So a lot more needs to be done to really bring diversification to the policy and to those areas that need uplifting. So I would say partnership is really key. ALU's report is great, but it needs to go beyond being a report to really operationalizing it. And I saw some comments online here. I do think that we need to look at this partnership to drive an Africa level wildlife economy policy framework and then drill down that mechanism through the structures that we have in Africa. One important structure is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and opportunities that creates for us, because trade is the hinge for almost everything we are talking about. So could we partner with them in thinking through where do we take this to the next level? So these are sort of my top line reflections. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think maybe in addition to what Lucy will say, and Ali, because I know Ali also has a very many years of experience in this field, I would maybe in addition to the questions I've asked, there's the primary and the key stakeholder, the local and indigenous communities. And looking historically, we have the Nagoya Protocol for benefit sharing. And this has been raised a lot. And one of the key reasons why I feel we lose some of these opportunities is the way we package this information. Lucy mentioned, and I think all of you mentioned about the aspect of course, the opportunities and the potential, but then the other culminating economic benefits, such as the ecosystem service valuation. I know Kenya, maybe you're working towards the direction and all that, and we have this and the Nagoya Protocol. So Lucy, in addition to your response, and also Ali Kaka, what would be the game changer? And how do we, again, make this work for the local region, especially East Africa or Kenya, where these topics are very edgy? Lucy?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Reinhard. Thank you. Let me start by saying we actually started having some informal conversations with some sectors in government to say, what would it take to unlock this sector? What do they see as barriers for this sector? Because it's not that people are inherently opposed to growing an economy. As Fred says, if it's good for the economy of the country and good for the people and is sustainable, why would people not buy into it? So let me say one of the things, at least for Kenya, that was clear is that people don't even understand. Fred, what you're saying is correct. Some people have been doing these things all along, but when we come with a new language, sometimes we lose them. So when we go and say we want to have a workshop on wildlife economy, people think it's a new idea from a foreign place to change how we appreciate or interact with wildlife. So going back to terminology, we even suggested, and this came from a group that were in that informal breakfast, that perhaps in some countries it is good to call it a biodiversity economy, because then people say, oh, so even when I'm doing sustainable agriculture, because wildlife economy already locks people into, it's a giraffe, it's an ostrich, it's a crocodile. And that's not all. In fact, the potential is so much more outside your typical tourism-focused species. So one, I would like to say we might want to think about language and whether that language means the same thing to different people in different contexts. I think in Kenya, biodiversity economy gets more ownership and attention and willingness to engage, whereas by wildlife economy, people think about all the things that we don't want, and we start, closing the barriers on that. But secondly, a game changer might be, how do we bring the economic sectors into this discussion? And I think it's part of what Fred was saying. When we are talking economy as ourselves as conservationists, are we talking to the groups, like Kenya has a group that does the economic analysis for the country? And I did call them and I said, in your economic analysis, do you ever analyze the opportunities around biodiversity? And they said, we don't know what those look like. So there's a gap both ways, that even those who do the economic analysis for the country have not understood what we are saying, because perhaps we are using conservation legalese in how we are, or conservation, sort of phrasing that doesn't necessarily communicate. So I think one game changer thing is to reduce the barrier between the economic sector and the conservation sector in this dialogue. And let's start seeing how we can get the language into those who develop economic models for a country. But I think the second one is really, how do we bring the landowner to be the center of this? In most of our places, some of these potential values are in shared spaces. And in some cases, the user rights are not clearly defined. And so people may feel we are pushing this only for government to benefit. So we need to see, how can our laws enable people to feel that they are also part of the conversation, they are part of the beneficiaries, and they do have, even if they cannot own the resource, like you cannot own in Kenya wildlife individually, it belongs to the state, can they own the products that come from that? So the whole issue of ownership and rights and use and access are going to be critical. And I think in the new policy framework, even for Kenya, as we review the whole, that's going to be critical. Otherwise, then you don't get buy-in from the landowners. And not only do you not get buy-in, you may also get activities that then compromise the potential that you're trying to grow. So bringing people closer to that discussion is going to be important. So one of the things we were proposing is a series of on-the-ground grassroots discussions where we understand from them, what do they see as the potential value of the biodiversity on their land, and what kind of value would they like to accrue to them in a sustainable manner. Thank you. Yeah.
And in your response, Ali, and with your experiences, in addition to what you say, is it possible to develop or achieve the full potential of wildlife economies in the region through the integrated forms of governance? Because we have the UNFCCC, we have CBD, we have CITES, and in most cases, we don't see the coordination. Maybe you might give us a snippet of these. Frank and Fred can add more. So over to you, Ali.
Yeah, thanks, Reynard. Let me start, first of all, from the last point that Lucy has just made, which I think is very important, and that is, how do we get the landowners owning the process, becoming the drivers of this process? There's no landowner who is foolish enough not to exploit to the maximum resources that are right there staring at him in the face. If there is any, shouldn't be a landowner in the first place. However, I think if we dig a little bit deeper, and this is very clear in the Kenyan case, external influence and external interference is, I think, in my opinion, the biggest problem that we have in the country. Yes, you can bring together the landowners, you can bring together the communities, but there are these guys who run around and try to stir the agenda in a different direction because perhaps it's a threat to their own. And I warned you, Renard, I'm going to talk very, starkly about this because where I am in my age, it doesn't bother me anymore. There is a problem there. This thing must be owned by the citizens themselves. They must be the ones to decide what is good for them, not somebody coming from somewhere else and saying, oh, no, you don't know what you're doing. What you're doing is wrong. No, unless Kenya stops this external influence and interference, we are not going to get anywhere. Okay, that having said, to go back to your point about the different frameworks available, yes, I think there is a need for more collaboration and working together to make sure the implementation of all these agreements and so on is implemented. Otherwise, we are going to continue to come up with all sorts of documents that are not implemented at the local level, let alone national level. There is a problem there that I think should be addressed, perhaps by the Institute or other players, to see how we can get this working better. And on the same point that you started with on the AU, I think there is room for the AU to step down to the national level. It should be just talking continentally and then leaving it at that. There must be a concerted effort by the AU to bring to the national level and maybe even through the national level to the local level, the agreements, the frameworks that they have been developing. The biggest problem I think we have is we have too much information. And most of this information is not acted upon to see implementation on the ground. I think we are rich in terms of information, and there's a continued flow of this information. But when you go down to the local level, really, implementation is either nil or very little. Can we stop and see if we can use all that we have and see them implemented, first of all, before we develop more. And there's so much room for everybody, private sector, local NGOs and other NGOs, and government itself, to see how this can be implemented by the citizens themselves, or to benefit the citizens themselves. So,
thank you very much. I think I'll drop in Fred next, and Frank, and maybe in your response, you could. I know right now countries are revising their NDC report under UNFCCC, and also I think Kenya, we have a draft NBSAP document. And picking up from what Ali mentioned about integrated forms of governance to achieve the full potentials of wildlife economies in the region, what are some of these key opportunities you see, especially should it be led by the non-state actors or the government sector, having in mind that in some cases, or in most cases, we have experienced conflicting institutional mandate. So who should take the lead, and do we have the full potentials around these areas, especially UNFCCC, CBD, CITES? Fred, and I'll drop in Frank.
Thanks a lot, Renard, and again, acknowledging my colleagues Lucy and Elikaka for the insightful comments earlier. I'm not entirely sure who should lead, and to some extent, countries are different in terms of how they structure. But if this is about wildlife economy, then really it should be sitting at the center of economic development in a country if we want it to be mainstreamed. Otherwise, it becomes something that is done on the side, and support for it becomes a little patchy. So I think that there needs to be a way in which we are connecting very, very strongly with the economic planning processes. And the reason I say this is that I believe, and I think it's also the position of my organization, that the mess we are in today in terms of biodiversity loss and climate change and pollution is because of the existing economic model that we have. The existing economic model is extractive in nature. It doesn't consider the role of people in a very deliberate way. Consumption is done without regard for its implications. So the economic model we have is fundamentally broken, okay? And so what we are dealing with really is a transformation of the economic model, not just an introduction of wildlife economy on the side. And if we see this that way, then the conversation we should be having is, what kind of economic model do we need in Africa? What kind of economic model do we need in Kenya? And in our opinion, wildlife and biodiversity needs to be at the center of it for two reasons. If it's at the center, it will benefit people, because the people that drive these economies are primarily women and local people. So the benefits are accruing to them directly. And secondly, because the benefits are accruing to them, they will care about those landscapes that are potential for conservation and that also deliver for them. And then consequently, we will potentially address the biodiversity loss and climate change challenges, okay? So there's a connection there. And we do now know that if we drop the ball on the issue now, we are going nowhere collectively. Our economies need a different direction, and wildlife economy and biodiversity needs to be at the center of it. So in my opinion, it needs to be centered. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but it's not centered at the moment. It's marginal. It needs to be at the center of our economic thinking and approach.
Thank you very much. Frank, I'd love your very brief input and exactly if you could add into what really went wrong in the 80s for Kenya. And Lucy, I'll jump onto you next in terms of the difference between Kenya and Tanzania. So Frank, what went wrong in the 80s?
Okay, I'll come in for a second. I just put a couple words together. Barriers. Lucy talks about barriers, and barriers are a key thing to address. connecting up the conventions and getting them more harmonious. In my mind, it's all about connecting targets 5 and 9 of the GBF, which on wildlife use, to CITES as an operational framework for sustainable and legal trade. So CITES puts in barriers. Lucy's worried about barriers, but there are barriers that are well-intended. They don't want the trade to go out if it's unsustainable and illegal. Well, that's fine. We all agree with that. So how can we look at unlocking this economy in a way that drives legal, sustainable, inclusive trade using the AFCFTA, using CITES, using the CBD framework, using the AOU, etc. And then the time with what Fred was just saying, why this is important is because the biodiversity economy is a circular economy. It's not an extractive economy, it's a renewable economy. So if you're going to change the economic framework of a country like Kenya, biodiversity, wildlife use is probably the way to start. Looking at what the people have, what the people own, what the people can use, and how to remove barriers that don't allow the economy to grow, and at the same time put in the standards, the regulations, the frameworks to drive sustainable use, renewable use, what have you. So it's the elements are all there, but it's piecing it together. And last comment is, yes, Ali, there's a lot of outside noise, but Kenya is a pretty powerful country on the continent. And I think if Kenya started to make some noise, it could become a driving force for wildlife use. And this outside noise you deal with won't compete with the knowledge, the wisdom that will come right out of your country. So I see Kenya as a leader in this process, not as somebody who's being attacked from the outside. Flip it around. Take the leadership role, which I think the country can do.
Thank you so much. So my final question to Lucy, then we have a 1 minute round. Lucy, similarities or disparities between Kenya and Tanzania, and is it possible to monitor or mainstream the aspect of gender in wildlife economies?
All right, I'm curious why particularly you'd like similarities between Kenya and Tanzania, because, maybe because they're our neighbor. But, well, I think we have a lot of, at least on the cross-border area, we do have a lot of shared biodiversity for one. So at an East Africa level, there is need for congruence on cross-border biodiversity management. I know there was a bill that was in the EAC a few years back. I'm not sure where it sits at now, but I think cross-border biodiversity conservation is a different matter, but an important one, because in East Africa, this region does have some of the highest biodiversity in Africa. I think the differences in policies between countries, for me, is never really a problem. I don't think all countries must have the same policies. I think we only need to worry where the policies, one country's policy, and that happens only largely at the borderline, may affect another country's policy if it is different. So for example, if you go to specific wildlife areas, you have hunting concessions in northern parts of Tanzania, and you have in Kenya where hunting is illegal and not allowed, but you have wildlife that migrates and moves into Tanzania. And if it gets hunted there, whose wildlife was it? And so we've had some issues, as you know, late last year and early this year. I think those sort of overlap issues are the ones that need to be addressed, but I don't think the fact that we have a policy different from Tanzania should be a problem. I think the greater concern is there biodiversity loss in one area that's protecting it and another area where it could be at risk? But I think countries can appreciate their own differences and still find ways to ensure biodiversity loss, or biodiversity is mainstreamed. I think the key thing is, are we mainstreaming biodiversity as a resource? And I like Fred's point, not just at a country level, at a continent level, because at that level, we can then agree on some few common principles that enable economy to be driven based on our understanding of how biodiversity sits in that economic agenda. I think women have always been central to how biodiversity is utilized. I think it's their role that's not as recognized as it should be. And I think the value accruing should also significantly accrue to women. A lot of the projects that are piloted with women groups. So I think creating producer groups that have gender sensitivity, ensuring benefits accruing are also sensitive to women in some of our cultures, which are patriarchal. The benefits only accrue to the men leadership. So again, our women voices at the center and at the front of some of the leadership discussions would be what I'd be looking at in how we frame the economy going forward.
Thank you very much. Yeah, as we wind up, I'll give the next floor for Frederick to give his final remarks, and especially if you could, all of you, give the next low-hanging fruit that we can take advantage of to push this agenda forward. But for Ali, I would really love to learn, maybe Kenya was the pioneer of wildlife economists in the region. What went right and what went wrong in the 80s in your final remarks? So I'll start with Fred, then Lucy, final remarks, then I'll hand over the floor to Ali and back to Marie. Fred.
Thank you very much, Reinhard. Said a lot, but one thing I think I want to say before we end this is that Africa is sitting on gold. There's so much potential, and we have the elements to make it work. Economies are based upon people and the economic power of those people, in a sense, the ability of those people to buy and trade. And in that respect, Africa has began to pull those pieces together. The Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is a really important one. And we need to start by looking at the markets on this continent and creating movements of produce and products back and forth. If we did that, Ali, we will be able to manage the pressures that are coming from the north and the west, because we are already creating value within the continent. We are not doing enough of that. And during COVID, I saw that in Kenya, that when KWS and the ministry, your ministry at the time, promoted local tourism, it went up significantly. The pricing changed and the market for it locally changed quite significantly. So we do know that there's a market locally for our products. We need to expand that market and look across borders and build capacity across borders. And as we gain that capacity within, we will be able to be in a better position to negotiate. Again, what I'm trying to say is that we are in a powerful position. We are not in a position where we need to be begging. We need to unlock that economy, and we need to start home and connect the dots between the countries and the products that we have, and then we can drive it. I think from a conservation perspective, we need to frame this differently. I think we are framing it too heavily from a conservation perspective, because that's who we are. I think we need to bring in the economies, the trade ministries, and those ministries that are relevant to driving these things. We need to bring in investors and turn this around, because this will be a game changer for conservation, but it can only be a game changer if other strategic partners are brought into the piece. So that would be my last comment, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Lucy and Ali.
Thank you. I think my closing remark will be that we need to have a community-centric framing of the value chain for these different elements of the biodiversity economy. I think the only way we can exploit it meaningfully and sustainably is if there's enough understanding of community of what is in it, what is the potential. Let's not underestimate how much knowledge there isn't out there. Understanding that value chain, but bringing in the investors then to enable that value chain to be recognized. So a community-centric unpacking of the value chain and very clear entry points for the different partnerships will be important, because it's low-hanging fruits, it's doable, the land's there, the people are there, but the capacity and the understanding of what it will take to develop that has not been explored fully. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with Lucy also on the people recognizing the opportunities and the potential of the wildlife economy. Before they do that, they must be allowed to take possession of this process and this conversation without outside interference. And Frank, I totally disagree with you, but we will take that offline. I think you need to learn a little bit more about our situation. I thought actually you had, but perhaps not. And we can have this conversation. I've been in the thick of it, but we were trying to change the law twice, not once, twice. And I know what I'm talking about when I say there was external interference. I can't go into details here, of course. To your question, Reinhard, what went wrong? Yes, Kenya was a leader. Kenya indeed was a leader in a lot of these wildlife economy activities. But then over time, you know, the Kenyans themselves, I think, lost that ownership of the whole process, and they took a seat back. So I think going forward, we need to concentrate on that. And I like what is being said, that we must bring the people to the center of this whole conversation and let them own this conversation, let them decide what is good for them and not somebody else. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, the very knowledgeable panelists, for your contribution and for your attendance, the audience. And we really look forward to making this work. At the very central part of the power, I believe taking or getting the public to rally behind the aspirations of these policies would be ideal and integral, and also working towards an integrated forms of governance systems would make this work towards helping us develop some of these transparency and accountability mechanisms for these policies to work. Otherwise, there's a bright future. We see a very good opportunities coming up, and I will hand over the floor back to where it belongs. Thank you so much, and see you next time. All right.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and thank you for everyone who's followed us through the series. If you want to have a look at it, please go to the African Wildlife Economy Institute website or the Share Screen Africa website to look at any previous events. Otherwise, thank you again for joining us, and thank you to our speakers and Reinhard for facilitating today. Have a good day. Bye.